Wealth inequality could be a major driver of societal collapse within the next decade. This is the headline statement of a report that's been published by King's College London, which is a pretty prestigious university in the UK. They gathered a panel of 25 academics, researchers, and policy professionals who unanimously agreed that wealth inequality could collapse society in the space of a decade. If you haven't actually been paying attention to inequality statistics, which most people don't, I just want to show you some headline stats. So in 2024, billionaire wealth surged by $2 trillion. This is 3 times faster than 2023, which on its own is quite an insane number. And if you look at the percentage of people in poverty in the US, it's remained basically unchanged over the last 50 plus years.
Poverty officially in the United States as measured by the government may look flat, but the average standard of living has gone down so much. And when you have working class people working 40 plus hours per week, barely able to afford a roof over their head, if at all, or having to move in with many people, I would argue that we're veering towards poverty, even if the government doesn't want to count it because they keep changing how they count that.
Globally, most think that children will be worse off than their parents. And it's not even close. In Canada, almost 4 in 5 people think that their kids are going to be worse off than their parents. France, it's over 80%, and you can see all of these countries hover around 75 to 80%. It's a level of pessimism that, depending on who you are, would have been pretty unfathomable in, say, the 1970s or even in the 1990s. And as per the report that I mentioned, it isn't just a matter of us getting poorer, but it's actually a serious collapse risk. And this specific report actually focuses mainly on the UK, but I think what they found can be generalized. There are also countries with incredibly high levels of inequality that are serving as a little bit of a canary in the coal mine, a predictor of where things are already headed. And I want us to focus mainly on one particular aspect that I think is super important, a feedback loop where inequality can affect politics and politics can affect inequality in this way that does nothing but make living standards worse for people. The feedback loop that they describe proceeds as follows. So you start off with a public service that experiences a shortfall in revenue, right? The state doesn't have enough money to offer the public services that it usually does. As the ultra wealthy have gotten wealthier and wealthier every year, the percentage of their wealth that goes towards the tax burden has followed the complete opposite trend. Since the 1970s, the rates of corporate income tax have completely cratered, and the rates of the top inheritance tax have also completely cratered. There's quite an infamous quote by Warren Buffett where he said,
I've used this illustration before, but I'm paying about the same percentage of my income to the federal government as my secretary.
And he's currently worth $140 billion. These public services then see a decline in quality. The decline in quality leads to massive public frustration and distrust of these institutions. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that people's level of faith in institutions has been falling, in public services has been falling. Instead of addressing them honestly, the solutions that we see given are often incredibly dishonest. Because those people who benefit from the shortfall in revenue are also those people who have an outsized influence on the political system.
I don't want to jump the gun here, but I think one of the things that makes it difficult to actually have meaningful conversations about our economic system, at least in the United States, but probably the West more broadly, is that we've been trained to be so fearful of communism and socialism, as we should be, right? Communism has led to more deaths than any other belief system. We should be afraid. We should veer away from communism. But that doesn't mean that we can't also critique capitalism and say, what can we do better? What inefficiencies are there in the market? Maybe, capitalism worship is another side of the spectrum that's not right. And I'll give you this example. Usually when it comes to talking politics, right, people look at it and go, there's 2 sides of the spectrum. You've got the fascist hard right. That's people like Hitler, right? And they kill people. Fascism is awful. And we can all agree on that. And then in politics, they'll go, the far left is people like Mao Zedong, communism. That kills people. When it comes to politics, we intuitively understand that there's 2 extremes on a spectrum that can be negative. I say all of that to say, try and have an open mind with these stats and with this video that you're watching here. I'm not somebody who's pro-communist, pro-socialist. I want less intervention in the market for the most part. But look, we have to address the problems that young people are facing today.
And the way this feedback loop ends is that the public services that are declining eventually collapse. And upon collapsing, they increase the relative strain on everything else. When the healthcare system starts to collapse, the strain on emergency services starts to increase. When the education system begins to collapse, the strain on healthcare begins to increase. Public services are like a disproportionately large part of the income of the less wealthy, unsurprisingly. And it's something that doesn't show up on like annual income statistics. So two countries that have, the same level of average income can have vastly different levels of quality of life based on how good the public services are. The Canadian Union of Public Employees estimated that the benefit of public services averaged around $12,500 per person. And you can imagine what $12,500 represents to someone who is on minimum wage compared to someone who earns $20 million a year. I wanted to give you like a concrete example of what happens when a public service ends up in this loop, and the solutions that are proposed are increasingly dishonest. And I think a good example is one that isn't talked about enough. It's Social Security in the US. So Social Security, if you're not American, is the US's state pension and disability benefit as well. It helps something like close to 70 million people a year. And the way it works is that the current batch of workers, pay a portion of their salary into the Social Security fund, and that fund is used to pay out the current retirees. In the event that there's actually an excess of money, that there's a surplus, they can redirect it to other government programs. Unfortunately, they've not really had a surplus since 2020. Since then, it's actually been running out of money. And the US government is pretty open about the fact that it's going to run out of money in 2034 unless it gets completely reformed. The lack of funding is leading to obviously open distrust. The Social Security benefits, for example, only increased by 2.5% in 2025, which if you have been subject to the current environment is probably not enough for you. And the solutions that have been offered have been quite dishonest. A senator, Mike Lee, suggests that the thing that's gone wrong is that Social Security wasn't invested into the stock market. And his argument is that this isn't just about retirement, it's about independence and controlling your own destiny. And that with Social Security, you control nothing.
I actually kind of agree with part of that. Mike Lee is actually the senator from Utah, which is where I live. Utah's a strange state. But I actually agree with his sort of free market aspect, or his free market outlook on Social Security doesn't leave you in control of your destiny. Look, every time we concede control over to the government for those who need it, right? We look at it and we say, okay, we had a lot of old people retiring that didn't have money to retire on their own. So we'll give control to the government to help that group. Every time you let the government in and you give them an inch, they take a mile. It's kind of like the relationship that somebody builds with a drug, right? You go, I'm going to try this drug one time, and then maybe you start trusting it a little bit more and more. And then before you know it, you're fully hooked on this drug and it's actually damaging you way more. You're not getting the benefit that you used to from the drug, and it's creating problems for you. And it's kind of that way with the government. When it comes to Social Security, it's so frustrating too, because, my whole life I've been told, Social Security is going to run out before you're an adult and you're able to pull from it. But then what does the government do? They tax more and more, a higher percentage of my paycheck for Social Security than past generations to try and account for that. So I'm getting taxed more for something that I'm told I'm not going to get, for a benefit that I'm told I'm not going to experience.
A fraction of tech companies, the Magnificent Seven, those companies make up basically the entire stock market. To put people's retirements into the stock market is to basically donate it to, Nvidia, Tesla, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft. However, if we try to look at some more honest reasons why US retirees are literally running out of money, you come on to some more sensible answers quite quickly. The way a typical progressive tax would work is the more you earn, the more you pay into the pot, right? Someone who earns $1 million pays more into the pot than someone who earns $20,000 a year. Social Security is completely different. They actually have a cap, right? So once you earn more than $168,000 a year, you don't have to pay any more into the fund. This is like a really big problem because it means that a person who earns $20 million a year contributes the same amount as a person who earns $200,000 a year.
What about a flat tax? Because right now, wealthy people actually pay less. And if you know the way, if you've ever owned a corporation and you know the way that corporate taxes work in the United States, by the way, a corporation doesn't have to be a big company. That could be you opened an LLC and you make $100,000 a year under that LLC. Right? The way that it works is there's 100 ways that you can avoid paying taxes. If you go, okay, my tax bill this year for my LLC is going to be $20,000. There's a bunch of tax benefits. Okay, I'll buy $20,000 worth of equipment, for my business. Maybe I'll buy new computers, I'll buy a truck or whatever for my business. And now you don't have to pay anything in taxes. So actually businesses end up paying virtually nothing in taxes. What would be nice is if there was a minimum flat tax rate. That would be at least a step. But the United States is run by companies at this point.
By the way, this cap here covers 94% of people. So for 94% of the population, Social Security basically just functions like a normal tax. If they earn more money, they're going to be taxed on it. For those who make millions and millions a year and who, for example, make their money from investments, they are not subject to Social Security. This would be by far the easiest way to fill the shortfall, because this is very unpalatable for people who earn significantly above the cap. It's far better for a senator, a person like Mike Lee, to simply suggest that the thing that's gone wrong is that the Social Security fund wasn't put into the stock market.
No, the problem with it is that this system was doomed to fail from the start. It assumed a flawed principle, which was that people would always have more children than there was of the original population, that people would always have more kids than enough to replace themselves. It was built in this sort of pyramid structure, which, as we're seeing with declining birth rates, check out the video I just made on that, birth rates are in decline right now. There's not more people. There's not, 5 kids to 1 adult like there used to be in the past. So a system like that is flawed and doomed to fail from the beginning. But instead of admitting defeat and saying, look, this is not sustainable, we, the government, came to you with a bad promise, they're going to try and find all these weird gimmicky solutions, try and duct tape it and make it work, right? The problem with that is we're putting so many extra resources into trying to make something work that we're actually creating even more heartache for people that are already strapped with their income, with the amount of money that they make.
There's a saying in Mexican Spanish, which you may well agree or disagree with. El que no tranza, no avanza. And it basically translates to, he who doesn't cheat doesn't get ahead. And it's not like, the people of Mexico are particularly predisposed to cheating public institutions, but rather the inequality levels have gotten so high that the incentive structures are completely thrown out of whack. And everyone has realized that their limited resources are less useful if they're put towards the public good. Instead, it makes a lot more sense to favor nepotism and corruption, even on an individual level, to the point where they have a saying for it. I was even able to find one survey which asked Mexican businessmen and entrepreneurs whether they agreed with the quote, right? El que no tranza, no avanza. And 38% of businessmen openly admitted to agreeing with it, with 64% of the people they asked believing that to advance in government, you have to be very corrupt. Inequality and corruption kind of go hand in hand.
We've all seen those stats where politicians, they go into Congress, right? And maybe their salary is something like $150,000 a year to $300,000 a year, but somehow they come out with $300 million or $100 million, $20 million. And Nancy Pelosi is probably the most notorious example of that, but it exists across the board between both parties.
It's not like the Mexican people are particularly predisposed to cheating. It's just that's what's been rewarded more and more, right? And I think this specifically, this sentiment is becoming increasingly visible in other countries that are having rising inequality. I'm sure all of you know at least, one person or know someone who knows someone who's been either scammed or who relies on scamming as a way to make a living. In the UK, fraudsters are stealing more than 3 million a day. In the US, nearly 80 million people lost money to scams in the last 5 years. And I think it's silly to say that people are just more evil now, more criminal. It makes a lot more sense for it to simply be a matter of incentive structures, where choosing the criminal path actually just makes a lot more sense.
And actually, doing white-collar crime, if you're going to be a criminal, you get significantly less sentencing than somebody who, let's say, is a drug dealer. If you're a drug dealer in the United States and you get caught, you get jammed, right? You might make, a couple $100,000 or whatever if you're a successful drug dealer, but you're going to go away to prison for 10 years plus, right? They have a lot of 10-year minimums. You've got to carry a weapon, whatever. People who do white-collar fraud, that sounds insane to say, but, scamming people online, finding cracks into Chase Bank or whatever financial institution, they're only serving, 2, 3, 4 years in prison, and they're not having to carry around a gun and deal with junkies, this, that. The system really does incentivize this sort of white-collar scamming, right? And even just if you're a reputable or a regular business scamming your customers, or if you're somebody who's been scammed by a business, you understand that the United States is so litigious, right? There's so much involved with suing somebody to making a situation right that you're going to have to cough up 10 grand, 5 grand, 20 grand just to have the lawsuit go to trial to potentially get something made right. So, if a dealership, like a car dealership, scams you out of $500, it's like, is it even worth it? The United States incentive structure is very much set up for those who already have assets to have all of the advantages.
In these super high inequality countries, we see some pretty stark divisions. Like if you've ever visited sub-Saharan Africa, somewhere like India, Brazil, or Mexico, you've likely seen how a country under really high levels of inequality can basically split into two countries, where the slums house the masses and the elite live not very far from them, but in completely different lives. And this is really the end game of inequality, right? It pushes you all the way back to a system that looks almost feudal. It has this knock-on effect where it becomes increasingly difficult for someone that's born in the lower social classes to move up the ladder. When you get to super high levels of inequality, it doesn't just become a problem day to day, but it becomes a problem that is like entrenched. What this graph tells us here is how many generations it takes for someone who's born in poverty to reach the average income in that country. In relatively low inequality countries like Denmark and Sweden, Norway and Finland, you can see that it takes about 2 to 3 generations. In much higher inequality countries like the US, it takes 5 generations. And in super high inequality countries like Brazil and South Africa, you can see that it can take on average 9 generations to move from being in poverty to reaching the average income in your country. As inequality rises, it becomes more and more entrenched, and simply like the birth lottery becomes disproportionately important. But it's not just that inequality can't exist, because Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden all have some degree of inequality, but have been able to compensate with strong public services, because public services represent a disproportionate amount of income for the poor than they do for the wealthy, and can actually give them that springboard. And what I find interesting is that like people in general globally favor some kind of change to their economic system, right? Even in the US, 2/3 of people want major change. But because we've ended up in this loop where the solutions that are offered are increasingly dishonest and are offered by people who benefit from things not changing much from how they are now, all of this energy has been kind of redirected away from what those people within the public services are telling us they need, right?
It's frustrating because he's so right? Like, all of the people in the government that want to offer you solutions are getting rich off of it, right? Like, and it's a bipartisan issue. Republicans and Democrats are getting rich off corruption. So how do you get a government like that to change the system? You know, this may be crazy to say, but I think one of the real problems is that the people don't have teeth anymore. The government used to really fear the will of the people. Oh, I don't want to screw over my constituents. Otherwise, you know what might happen, right? Coming out of the French Revolution, coming out of, the whole American independence movement. So I think the politicians just don't fear the public in a way that they should anymore. And, that's partially the public's fault. You've had generations that are like very trusting of the government, that don't want smoke with the government. But fundamentally, some of my problems with capitalism as it's implemented in the United States is that so many of the policies that are created really do favor the incumbents or those who already have a lot of wealth, right? So as much as I'm somebody who definitely leans politically right now in the United States, some of those left ideas from the 1940s, right? Like trust busting, we do need to bring some of that back. He talked about the stock market earlier. And if you look at this, increasingly, the stock market is becoming more concentrated. And that's really indicative of the US economy more broadly, as it used to be that there was a lot of entrepreneurs spread across the United States. There was a lot of small family businesses in different communities had different economies, whereas now everything is being streamlined and all of the wealth is being just taken by the top from everybody else. A system like that is not sustainable. And you guys can look at me and say like, oh, he's bashing on capitalism. He's some sort of socialist or something. I'm not. But what I'm trying to tell you is if you want to continue this system, if you really want to just stick with this system, you're going to have a United States that is unrecognizable and very violent in just a couple of generations. This does not go well. This path that we're on right now is not sustainable. You understand? Your kids are not going to be in a safe place if this continues to happen. And so I would really like to encourage people, maybe let's start thinking about what alternatives can we come up with? How do we stand up to this? Because the wealth inequality in the United States is not just, oh, well, that guy over there, he owns a business, so he has a nicer truck than me. It's increasingly becoming most young people cannot afford a home and they can barely afford to rent an apartment. There's a housing shortage and nobody's doing anything about it. Groceries going up in price with all of the money that's printed, inflation, people are struggling to afford groceries. That's not a sustainable or a healthy society. So in the interest of staying solutions oriented, what can we do? We can stop printing money. This whole fiat experiment with the US dollar where we print a bunch of money during COVID, what happens? All of that money trickles back to the top. You think about it, right? If the average person gets $2,000 in stimulus and you have a lot of people that get that stimulus, right? What do they need? They need to spend it on groceries. Maybe they need to spend it on oil changes, new tires for their car, whatever. All of the business owners in the United States are immediately getting this massive influx of cash, right? If you're the person who owns a grocery store and suddenly everybody's buying a few extra groceries, you're getting a lot of money. If you're the guy who owns, right, the tire shop, suddenly everyone's coming in and finally getting those tire changes that they need with that $2,000 stimulus. Suddenly you're getting this big flux of money. What happens when you have all this extra money out of nowhere after the stimulus spending? You can go and buy all of these single family homes. You can go and start to buy real estate. You can go and inflate asset prices by spending all of your extra money on assets, which then puts it further out of reach for the average person who just got their stimulus check. And that's what we saw. So we need to discourage the government from spending more money. I know I'm kind of ranting here, but I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. What solutions can we add to the US economy to help fix it? My name is Mitchell. Thank you guys so much for watching. Check out one of these other videos. God bless you guys, and I'm out.